Hello, I'm Chris Mihm with the United States Government Accountability Office. Welcome to Module 3 of the IDI-KSC e-learning course on auditing national preparedness to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. By now, you've been introduced to the overall project that we have, as well as gotten a detailed understanding of the 2030 Agenda, as you can see from this first slide, which shows the graphic with the 17 goals. You know, and as you heard in the last module, about the importance of the 2030 Agenda for peace, prosperity, and each of the countries and each of our national governments and our people. And you've understood the key role that follow-up and review will have as part of national implementation, regional implementation, and global implementation. You, in the work that you do, will be an instrumental part of that to make sure that decision makers at all levels, especially at the national level, have the information, perspective, and thoughtful recommendations that they need in order to successfully execute on each of our country's sustainable development goals. As you go to the next slide, one of the things there are three things that I want to cover with you today. First, to talk a little bit about the whole of government perspective, what it is and what it means for us as auditors. Second, to put that in the particular context of the audits that we will do as part of the 2030 Agenda. And then third, talk about some of the challenges to national governance, and therefore challenges that we as auditors will face when we use a whole of government perspective in order to audit national preparedness. But before I do that, let me just get to what the real bottom line of everything that I'm going to be talking about with us today over the next few minutes. In order to successfully attain our sustainable development objectives at the national level, our governments are going to need new and different ways of doing business, new and different ways of thinking, and new and different management capabilities. That puts a burden and a requirement on us as auditors to make sure that our tools, our approaches, our methodologies for performance audit evolve in tandem with the sophistication of the governance structures our countries are using. So just like our governments will be challenged in order to effectively implement the agenda, so too we as auditors must think and act differently if we're going to be able to audit in this environment. But before I talk about what's new and different, let me just remind us, each of us, that as you can see on this next slide, that we're just doing a performance audit. And a performance audit is just looking at, using established criteria, how various programs, operations, or functions of our government are doing in terms of economy, effectiveness, and efficiency against that established criteria. What is new and different is that rather than looking at a single program, we're going to be looking at a complex arrangement of programs and initiatives that cut across various government ministries, that cut across various levels of government, and often will cut across various sectors. As you can see on the next slide, this is the traditional program logic model that we use in all of our audits, and it's often used as the way governments manage their programs. They look at the inputs, that is the dollars and the resources and the staff that they get. What are the outputs that are purchased and created as a result of those inputs? That is, what is actually done with that money? And then finally, we make judgments in performance audits about what the outcomes are that are achieved. And that's a tried and true and very legitimate and appropriate way of both managing programs and doing performance audits. What I want to suggest to you, though, is that a whole of government perspective takes a somewhat different view on this. As you can see on the next slide, while there isn't one single standard definition for what whole of government means, what it's really about when you get to the bottom line is what is the interplay of ministries, programs, initiatives, and functions. So rather than looking at a single operation or a single program, we're looking at how they work together in a coherent and hopefully coordinated way to achieve a larger set of outcomes. What I want to suggest then to us is that rather than that program logic model that we saw a moment ago, the world more looks like what we see on the next slide. That is, with the outcome at the center and then a variety of programs and initiatives that influence that outcome. Think of everything important that we're trying to achieve with each of our national governments, whether it be, well, certainly on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, economic development, dealing with climate change, education, food security, gender equity, and again, any important outcome that we're trying to achieve. It's not going to be caused or achieved by a single program, operate in isolation from other programs and initiatives. Rather, it's going to be achieved only when we have a variety of programs working together, again, often with different levels of government if we're in a federal system, but often across sectors and with national and international civil society organizations in a coordinated way in order to achieve that objective. As you can see on the next slide, just using climate change adaptation as an example, this is what a whole of government perspective could look like. We could do a performance audit on any one of the branches that you see in this slide. We could do a performance audit on any one of the various elements on one of those branches. But a whole of government actually seeks to bring all that together, to ask the larger question of how is everything working together in a coordinated way to deal with climate change adaptation. Now, this is obviously a very complicated picture that I've shown you here, but it's designed to show the types of thinking that we will engage in and the types of performance audits that we will do in order to be successful in assessing national preparedness to implement the 2030 agenda. So then, as we see on this next slide, what are the capacities that our governments are going to need in order to effectively implement their national sustainable development objectives? And as you can see, the first part of that is thinking in a cross-cutting and integrated way. Rather than looking at the operations of any single program or agency, thinking about that from a whole of government perspective. It's about thinking about policy coherence and risk across the system and the delivery chain rather than the enterprise risk of any particular organization. It's about using data and evidence in order to drive decisions. It's about building the capacity of the center of government, those basic state institutions, in new and different ways. And that is to think about how can the center of government effectively lead and manage broad, cross-cutting strategic initiatives across an entire federal government. The point that I want to leave with you here, well, as you can see this list, and obviously I'm not going through each one of them in detail, is that it will entail a whole of government perspective, entails new and different capacities for our government. These are all things that we can and should be auditing from the performance auditing perspective. Let me give you a specific example of what this means in the context of the U.S. food safety system, and that is dealing with the wonderful example of the food safety over a single egg. Before I get to that, though, just to let you know, food safety is a major, not just global, but national issue here within the United States. As you can see from this next slide, we have people that die each year due to foodborne illnesses, we have economic losses and hospitalizations. And yet we have a very complex web of programs and agencies that are designed to assure us of the safety of our food. In fact, we have 16 different agencies implementing 30 or more different food safety laws that need to operate in a coordinated way if we're going to have safe food here in the United States. Obviously, all of this is exacerbated by globalization, where we're increasingly importing fresh produce and seafood, just like many other nations around the world. What does that mean, though, for an egg? And let me give you the example of dealing with a salmonella outbreak that we had a number of years ago that led to the recall of over 500 million eggs. So here are the agencies that are responsible for egg safety. As we go to the next slide, you can see the array of federal agencies that are responsible just for the inspection of a single egg. Beginning with what we have as FDA, which is our Food and Drug Administration, in one cabinet department, one ministry in the United States, that's responsible for the whole egg. The moment that egg is cracked, it becomes a processed egg product, responsibility for which shifts over to a different federal agency. We have yet another agency that sets the grade standards. We have yet another agency that makes sure the hens are okay. We have yet another agency that makes sure that the food is okay. The point to all this is that each individual program, each individual agency could be operating at peak efficiency and effectiveness, could be following the law, could be doing what it should be doing, could be doing the required inspections. In other words, you could have individual rationality, but the collective irrationality, that when it comes together, it's not an effectively coordinated system. And indeed, that's the case here in the U.S. as you go to the next slide. As you will see, Congress has taken action to reform our food safety system by what was called the FDA the Modernization Act that called for a more integrated approach to food safety. And the last administration under President Obama formed a food safety working group to try to bring together the agencies that dealt with food safety. Ultimately, that was not successful. The point, again, is that individual rationality, you can go through that logic model that we showed earlier of the inputs and the outputs and the outcomes, and you can identify how the agencies are being effective. But overall, if you don't put at the center, as I showed you in that other graphic, if you don't put at the center the outcome of food safety and the reductions of deaths and illnesses and economic losses from foodborne illnesses, you won't get that complete picture and won't be understanding the interrelationship among the various agencies. And so to conclude, as you can see on this last slide with what this means for us as auditors, this is just an illustrative set of questions that could be asked as we do our audits about how we're integrating, or each of our countries is integrating, the 2030 Agenda into our own national institutions and planning frameworks, how we're involving stakeholders and making sure that they are an active part of the process, how our governments are making sure that they've allocated responsibility among the various stakeholders and levels of government and sectors, and then finally how they're making sure that implementation is proceeding in an integrated and inclusive way so that nobody is being left behind. This is an exciting time to be an auditor because we have an opportunity to participate in really some groundbreaking work that's going to help our colleagues in our national government. It's going to contribute to regional and global and thematic follow-up and review of the 2030 Agenda. Our countries have enormous challenges and opportunities. So too do we as auditors have enormous challenges and opportunities. But the performance auditing standards, the performance auditing approaches that we've used provide an excellent base for us as we move forward and think of a whole of government perspective and use performance auditing in order to assess national progress in implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I look forward to working with you in the coming months on this, and it's been a great pleasure to meet with you today. Thank you so much.